So I am so pleased to welcome Dr. Sharon Egretta Sutton, FAIA, to Atlanta and to Georgia Tech. I think she's been to Atlanta several times, never to Georgia Tech. So happy that we have her here with us. I've invited Christian Coles, a lecturer here in the School of Architecture, to moderate the discussion with Sharon following her lecture. Christian is dedicated to designing for minority communities, especially the African American community, and delving into the human aspect of architecture and urban design by integrating psychological principles into his work. He earned his Bachelor of Science in Architecture alongside a certificate in psychology from Georgia Tech in 2016. He was actually one of my students in the second studio that I taught here my first year that I joined Georgia Tech. Following his program here, he went on to the University of Michigan, where he earned his Master of Architecture and exploring the intersection of architectural design and human psychology. Christian has previously taught studio courses at Kennesaw State University on cultural efficacy through design and regenerative urban design in Atlanta's Sweet Auburn neighborhood. He also teaches a course on African American design and aesthetics through CPDI Africa. And we're so happy that he is currently part of our own studio faculty teaching undergraduate design studios here in the School of Architecture. Sharon is an educator, an author, a fine artist, and a citizen architect. Her achievements are lengthy, and she is no stranger to breaking new ground in architecture. She is the first African American to receive the AIA-ACSA Topaz Medallion for Excellence in Architectural Education. She is the 12th African American woman to be licensed to practice architecture in the United States. She is the first African American woman to be promoted to full professor and the second to be elevated to AIA fellowship. And this, which I did not know previously, she holds 5 academic degrees across music, architecture, philosophy, and psychology. And she's also, if that wasn't enough, she studied printmaking internationally. Under her tutelage, a roster of transformative leaders has risen to pivotal positions in both architectural practice and in education. She is currently a distinguished visiting professor at Parsons School of Design and has previously served on the faculties at Columbia University, Pratt Institute, University of Cincinnati, University of Michigan, and the University of Washington. So before I invite Sharon to the stage, I just want to share a little bit about our own overlapping histories. Sharon spent 12 and a half years in Ann Arbor at the University of Michigan. Many of you know that I arrived in Detroit in 1996-97 to begin my own teaching and practice career. We overlap by maybe a year, maybe 2. I sincerely wish we had met in my early days, forging my own path in the academy and in practice. I would have loved to debate the challenges of practicing and teaching in Detroit, especially as a young Korean American woman striving to find her own place as a practitioner and as an educator in a city that was shrinking, but ripe with potential, and in a field that was full of both opportunity and challenges. In 2020, our universes intersected again in the most wonderful way. We were co-authors in the book Teaching and Designing in Detroit, 10 Women on Pedagogy and Practice, edited by Libby Balter Bloom and Stephen Vogel, the dean who first hired me in Detroit. Sharon's afterword was insightful and it was sharp. It offers broad context for the significance and the importance of community-engaged practice and pedagogy, particularly through the diverse sets of lenses of the women whose voices were included in this book. Sharon is a fearless and inspirational leader. She's an advocate for pedagogy that can help architecture students become leaders of public dialogue in the commons. She asserts that this offers a pathway for students to acquire the practical skills and habits of mind to help people work together toward achieving architecture's promise to improve the quality of life for all members of society. She'll talk about this and more today in this lecture and discussion on her recent book, Pedagogy of a Beloved Commons, Pursuing Democracy's Promise Through Place-Based Activism. Following the lecture, please join us in the West Architecture first floor atrium for a reception and a book signing. And now, please join me with a warm welcome to Sharon Egretta Sutton.
So good afternoon. Let the church say good afternoon. I am delighted to visit Georgia Tech and have an opportunity to meet with the NOMAS students this morning, or I guess it was this afternoon. And it's been a long day. Also to share my thoughts with you in this lecture. Though it's my first time at Georgia Tech, I have actually three special connections to the Department of Architecture. One is with the department chair, Julie, who with her team went out of her way to make this a wonderful visit for me, and I am very appreciative for that. She mentioned to you that a few years ago, she was one of 10 pioneering women to share their stories about teaching and designing in Detroit while serving on the faculty of the University of Detroit Mercy, and that I wrote the afterword for that book. And like Julie, I speculated about what it might have been like to know her while I was on the faculty at the University of Michigan, because we were simultaneously working in Detroit, tackling the issue of how to re-inhabit what she characterized as the city's raw and gritty vacant space. Another connection is with my lunch partner, whose studio I just visited, the 2022 Ventilet Next Fellow, Andy Brunner. Right before he left New York City to come here, we worked together on one of 4 design teams that the New York chapter of the AIA selected to create an exhibition. Our team's contribution, entitled Decolonizing Suburbia, explored strategies for retrofitting the single-family fabric of the neighborhood where I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio. My connection with Andy leads to the third one with my AV assistant, Professor Ellen Dunham Jones, who is the guru of retrofitting suburbia for all sorts of social, economic, ecological, and aesthetic reasons. I do not think that I would be speaking out of school if I said that across our different generations and areas of focus, the three of us share an interest in architecture that enables engaged, equitable, and sustainable communities. My book, Pedagogy of a Beloved Commons, describes how community-based organizations can involve young people as agents of change in envisioning such communities. This afternoon, I hope to convince you that their approach to nurturing young people can inform your own commitment to helping aspiring architects become agents of change in an increasingly thorny world. Architecture is first and foremost a social process. As Professor Dana Cuff wrote in her book, The Story of Practice, architecture is a social construction that emerges from the collective action of many players. It entails the combined agency of designers, clients, builders, and the public, who together influence its function, and built form. While the simplest projects may entail cooperation among just a handful of people, most entail many people working together toward a common vision, with more contentious ones, especially those involving historically marginalized populations, often requiring complex negotiations among competing interest groups. That is to say, the design and construction process entails expert social skills. Let's take the National Museum of African American History and Culture as an example of architecture as a social construction. Creating this building entailed a 100-year process involving countless players. Its social construction began in 1915, when Black veterans of the Union Army first campaigned for a memorial to honor their achievements. The idea inched forward in 1929, when Congress adopted legislation authorizing a monument, but failed to allocate funding, which put the project on hold for over 40 years. Still, in the afterglow of the civil rights movement, the idea resurfaced as Congress debated whether they should fund the museum. An African-American museologist debated whether a white institution could possibly represent Black history. After various starts and stops, the project lurched forward in 2001, when, at the behest of Congressman John Lewis, George W. Bush created a presidential commission to study the idea. In 2003, Congress appropriated planning funds and authorized the Smithsonian to adopt the project. Then, between 2004 and 2005, the Smithsonian established a board of 19 luminaries, including Oprah Winfrey, named Dr. Lonnie G. Bunch to be museum director, and, with encouragement from George W., designated a site on the National Mall. Bunch hired a briefing team headed by J. Max Bond Jr., a pioneer African-American architect who had designed buildings throughout the world, and Phil Freelon, who was a generation younger and had created educational buildings and an African-American museum in Baltimore. To undertake a 2-year community engagement process, they expanded their team to include exhibition designers, museum programmers, educators, experts in audience research, and engineers. The brief they produced evolved in response to a physical survey and data from structured focus groups, informal street surveys, market share analyses, and modeling of comparable institutions. It determined the configuration of a 313,000 square foot building with everything from elevators and boilers to the gift shop specified. It also set the budget at $330 million for the building and $170 million for exhibition programming. With a brief in hand, Dr. Bunch not only raised the funds to sponsor an international competition, but he also engaged the public in voting for their preferred design because he believed that transparency in the decision-making process was essential in achieving a successful outcome. During the jury deliberations, two of the competing teams rose to the top. But Dr. Bunch expressed concern that one of the teams would subordinate staff ideas about the museum in achieving the architect's design vision. Ultimately, the jury unanimously selected a team consisting of the Freeland Group, Adage Associates, and Davis Brody Bond. A 3-year design process began in 2009 that eventually included 4 architecture firms and a 33-person staff, 31 consultants, 2,000 sheets of drawings, 6,000 pages of specifications, and multiple review agencies, including the Secret Service. After an additional 3-year construction process involving untold workers, the museum officially opened on a beautiful Saturday in September 2016. President Barack Obama, the 99-year-old Ruth Bonner, and their respective families rang the Freedom Bell, kicking off a public celebration on the Washington Monument grounds that included musical performances, spoken word, oral history, and storytelling, and interactive workshops. Subsequently, it became the nation's 5th most popular museum, welcoming 1,600,000 visitors in 2023. The 100-year social construction of the National Museum of African American History and Culture consisted of political advocacy and policymaking, having a vision that could attract luminaries and significant funding, and assembling expertise, including a museum director, advisors, staff, architects, engineers, and designers, and undertaking a community-engaged briefing process and international design competition. Only at the end did the design skills and aptitudes of a NAB-accredited architecture education come into play. 91 years into the process. As my mentor, J. Max Bond, stated, and this is a quote, "In the life of a building, our moment is brief," end of quote. Like other advocates of participatory design, he believed that involving occupants in designing their own space would extend that moment. I agree, but also envision moving further upstream in socially constructing the built space of cities, the built environment, whether it be to retrofit suburbia, re-inhabit the raw and gritty vacant space of cities, or take on any of the many current design challenges, given that people cannot agree on much of anything. To illustrate how architecture schools might better prepare students to help people work together toward a common vision of their world, I will describe the pedagogy that the community-based organizations in my book employed in their work with historically marginalized youth. The idea for the book began with a study I conducted in the early 2000s for the Ford Foundation to identify what kind of after-school programs would attract older and low-income youth of color. That study revealed many instances of this population working together to improve their deteriorated neighborhoods, even while being stereotyped as problems. Later on, as Donald Trump moved into the White House and divisiveness became the order of the day, I decided to revisit the study with an eye toward amplifying the collaborative spirit I had observed among the youth in the community-based organizations. My publisher, Fordham University Press, had just begun a new series on urban studies that examines what makes a good community and how people learn to live together effectively. Working with the series editor, I eventually reshaped the book as a story about how youth can improve their deteriorated neighborhoods and in the process, learn to live together. I anchored my notion of simultaneously improving individuals and communities in the work of Paulo Freire. Has anybody read Paulo Freire? 2 people? Oh, you better get to the library. Well, maybe you will after I tell you about him. Paulo Freire is a Brazilian educator who is credited with developing a critical pedagogy that helps poor people change their circumstances. He believed that all human beings, no matter their level of education, are capable of joining with others to look analytically at their world. Freire identified critical consciousness, being critically aware of your circumstances, as the key in helping poor people develop a new self-awareness, sense of dignity, and hopefulness about the future. That if you're critically aware of why something is happening to you, you have the ability to change that thing. His pedagogy, which educators worldwide have successfully transferred to many different struggles for justice, helps people generate a collective understanding of inequality, validates their experiential knowledge, and helps them develop unconventional ways of thinking so they can work together and take transformative action. If you're living in the margins, in order to change your circumstances, you must think outside of the box, because the box is not working for you. As an architect, I wanted to disrupt negative stereotypes about youth of color by documenting the actions they take to transform the commons of their neighborhoods, beginning with the pre-industrial concept of unenclosed land where peasants shared the resources of the Barrens Manor, I defined the commons as a literal stage where young people can experiment hands-on with collective life. For example, by working together to plant gardens, recycle waste, organize neighborhood festivals, rehab houses, or paint murals. When their experiments grow out of a critical awareness of the underlying causes of the inequalities in their communities, their hands-on activities rise to the level of what I refer to as place-based activism. Without critical awareness, if they're just fixing something up, their efforts are merely community service. In the book, I draw upon interviews with the constituents of 3 exemplary programs, including youth, staff, parents, and community members, to characterize their lived experience of critical pedagogy. Through the interviewees, I learned that the young people, I gotta get to my right place here, developed place awareness through structured dialogue about the history, culture, and physical fabric of their neighborhoods, that they developed place agency by having access to information, resources, skills, and social capital, and that they worked together to take collective action and engage in what I refer to as critical placemaking. Typically, placemaking consists of reimagining public space so as to enhance the sense of belonging within a community. Professionals often undertake placemaking to increase the marketability of public space. They may or may not involve community members, and in fact, may even marginalize some of them. For example, teenagers, the elderly, or the houseless, who do not fit within their commodified vision. Critical placemaking instead overlays a social justice agenda onto the reimagining process, centering community members as essential actors in enhancing their surroundings. Critical placemaking can help low-income youth of color change their circumstances in countless ways, from improving the actual infrastructure of their schools and neighborhoods to provoking dialogue on needed policy changes, or simply celebrating community icons. At the same time, it elevates young people's right to be present in the public domain and have a voice in determining their own future. I contend that critical placemaking can help change the racial stereotypes that threaten the fundamental dignity of youth of color, and have empirical evidence that paradoxically, the disinvested neighborhoods where they witness daily reminders of their marginal status can, in fact, serve as a call to action. Now I'm going to show how 2 of the organizations in my book engaged young people in place-based activism. As I describe their pedagogy, I want you to be thinking about its alignment with your own design studio pedagogy and whether a more critically aware communal approach to problem solving would heighten your ability to engage in socially constructing the built environment. Let me begin by introducing Activism, my pseudonym for a nationally recognized organization in Harlem, New York, that developed African American, Latino, and Latina youth as critical thinkers and leaders. I'm using a pseudonym because this is human subjects research or research involving people, and the requirement is that I protect the confidentiality of the contributors to the theories that I'm building in case they're not right or helpful to the actual organization. The program began as a community service project of two Harlem-born university seniors who established the program in their own former high school after earning their degrees. So they grew up, went to a high school, went away to Brown University, did a community service project, and came back and established it in their high school. They created spaces within the school and city at large where the members of small chapters could meet to engage in critically analyzing the injustices they experienced at school, where armed police officers were ever present. Through these conversations, they developed the language to characterize structural problems that they had always assumed were their own fault. Over a period of years, the youth attended weekly adult-led study sessions that covered history, literature, and revolutionary movements, while also participating in youth-led organizing sessions to undertake campaigns and community service projects. Together, these sessions allowed the youth to develop the confidence that they could rise above low societal expectations and achieve their dreams. Academe staff not only provided a safe space for the youth to share their personal experiences, but they also helped them develop solidarity and practice interdependence through wilderness retreats and travel locally and abroad. Academe staff also helped the youth achieve a sense of collective agency. They gave them a voice in running the organization, provided them with culturally relevant knowledge to advance their schoolwork, disseminated their writing to the larger community, and provided them with opportunities to serve as spokespersons for the organization. Staff motivated the youth through love, financial support, and intergenerational relationships, modeling a family and community that supports its members. Above all, they offered an intergenerational ladder for developing shared values, prompting the youth to be responsible contributors to their community. Finally, staff engaged the youth in collective action, the hoped-for outcome of critical pedagogy, and pushing to redevelop a condemned school took center stage in Academe's place-based activism for many years. Initially, the youth organized to prevent a group of industrialists from converting the building into high-end apartments, which would have violated legislation requiring the redevelopment to be 85% for community youth. Because the structure had been vacant for about 30 years, the industrialists were banking upon amnesia. But the youth collaborated with many individuals and organizations to uncover the building's history and raise awareness of the legislation. Then they created a traveling exhibition using interviews with the school's alumni, who were actually their parents and relatives. One staff member recalled that as a result of the exhibition, the youth were invited to appear on radio stations and at community meetings. Describing how people reacted to their presence, she explained that, and this is a quote from an interview, it wasn't like, oh my God, like these annoying kids. It was like, damn, they are not going to stop. They're going to bring it up again. What are we doing about that? We don't know the answer. Now we got to tell them there's no answer. End of quote. One of the co-founders also recalled that once the young people entered the building, knowing that it was illegal to do so, explaining that, and this is another quote, we didn't sleep in there, but we went inside. We made this huge banner, 3 stories high, and we put it out of the windows of the building and tied it up there. And so what we were able to do was make basically a billboard on the side of the building that said, you know, demand a community center, call Reverend so-and-so, here's his number, and put the phone number up there. So it was an opportunity to enter the space, utilize the space, and kind of put our message on the building, end of quote. Academ's campaign to redevelop the abandoned school was not successful for many years, but eventually it did become a community center, an inspiring example of critical placemaking in which the youth helped their neighbors reimagine an important community landmark. Now let me introduce Hulu'opio Farms, a social enterprise located in a quasi-rural, quasi-suburban town called Waianae, which is on the west coast of Hawaii's 3rd largest and most culturally diverse island of Oahu. The organization was founded by a couple who, with the help of an extended family of advisors, set out to grow organic produce for Waianae's impoverished, predominantly Native Hawaiian community. They also set out to grow young people and help them rise above their colonial stereotype of being lazy and stupid. To address this twofold mission, Hulu'opio offered internships for high school graduates that combined hands-on farm work with classroom learning. Most interns were Hawaiian, 17 to 25 years old, with females making up 60% of cohorts due to high rates of illiteracy, alcoholism, and incarceration among males. The interns were paid to work 18 hours per week and were obliged to volunteer an additional 2 hours, though some contributed much more. They learned the farming cycle of by working alongside youth mentors who were alumni from previous years to prepare soil, plant, weed, thin, nurture to maturity, harvest, and begin the cycle over again. They were also charged with running a farmer's market and with encouraging healthy eating habits at the market, in the public schools, at community events, and even within their own families. Hulu'opio adapted its critical pedagogy to the Waianae youth, who were not only unaware of the historical trauma that Native Hawaiians had experienced, but also had bought into the fast food consumer culture that surrounded them. To help the youth shift from wanting to make money to buy stuff to wanting to improve the community, Hulu'opio grounded its approach to developing place awareness and place agency in the hands-on labor of malama aina, or taking care of the land. Staff equipped the interns with the know-how to cultivate Waianae's fallow pastures and advocate for protecting its natural resources. The interns first learn to cultivate 5 acres of land, and then they developed the political savvy to convince community leaders that they could cultivate 26 acres, and then 281 acres. They began clearing the land, restoring its natural systems, and planting it with a variety of organic crops, including traditional crops. They learned to cook traditional dishes that they prepared with handmade implements, and they encouraged younger youth to follow in their footsteps, helping them make gardens in their schoolyards and teaching them how to garden at home. Initially, the interns provided food for a locally owned cafe and engaged their families and neighbors in doing seasonal tasks on the farm, which helped recreate the indigenous farming culture that agribusiness had devalued as backward. Sometimes they put on concerts that raised money, entertained, and also showed off their organizational skills. To help overweight adults adopt healthier eating habits, they sold or gave away organic produce at their farmers market, took veggies home for their families and neighbors, and at every opportunity instructed anyone who would listen in good eating habits. Joining with the elders, they advocated for reclaiming Waianae's stolen ecological resources. They not only testified at meetings against contamination from the US military occupation, a proposed expansion of an industrial waste site, and the tourist industry's piping of fresh water from their community, but they also took high school students with them who amplified their voices. During the pandemic, these young farmers ramped up production in order to supply tons of free food to their neighbors. Over a period of 20 years, the interns' willingness to work in the mud, which is the way they described farming in Hawaii, made Hulu'opio the area's 3rd largest private landowner. Hulu'opio helped an expanding cohort of young people become compassionate activists who work hands-on to care for the land. Its pedagogy empowering them and their extended families with the agricultural, entrepreneurial, and political expertise to reclaim the land that colonizers had exploited. By centering learning in culture, spirituality, and nature, Hulu'opio's pedagogy created a counter-narrative to education's increasingly market-driven purpose. Now let me circle back to architecture. Interestingly, the kind of critical placemaking that Academe and Hulu Opio engaged in occurs in community design centers, most of which are located within colleges of architecture and urban planning. Community design centers emerged in response to the destruction of vibrant Black neighborhoods by racist urban renewal policies that bulldozed them in order to build interstate highways connecting white suburbs with downtowns. The first two CDCs formed in 1963, both in New York City, creating the models of community and university design centers that exist today. The Architects Renewal Committee in Harlem, or ARCH, was one of the two pioneer CDCs founded with the specific mission of helping Harlem residents have a voice in planning and design decisions. The organization launched with an all-white staff, but a predominantly African-American staff took the lead in 1967 and shifted its mission to resisting and revising official urban development plans. For example, to counter the city's plan to turn the East Harlem Triangle into an industrial zone, ARCH proposed transforming the area into a distinctive Black and democratic urban space. ARCH also sought to increase the number of Black professionals who could represent the interest of Harlem residents. Toward this end, the organization ran a pre-college program for Black high school students that offered summer courses and placements in architecture firms, and also awarded successful trainees full tuition scholarships to study architecture. ARCH established the model for community-based design centers, a fragile one that relies upon continually securing government, foundation, and corporate grants and private gifts, likely due to the government cutbacks in funding of the Nixon era. ARCH folded after 7 years in 1970. Nevertheless, the Neighborhood Design Center in Baltimore, founded in 1968, was able to survive those cutbacks and remains today as an inspiring example of community-led critical placemaking in the public domain. There are others, but I mentioned the Baltimore one, the Neighborhood Design Center, because it's about the same era as ARCH and survived those same cuts. The Pratt Center was the other pioneer CDC and formed after urban planning students and faculty at Pratt Institute began working with community organizations nearby the school. Its mission was to help local residents participate in official planning processes. Today, the Pratt Center builds upon its 61-year success as the nation's first university-based design center, continuing to foster a more equitable and sustainable city. University-based CDCs are more prevalent than community-based ones. They follow the model established by the Pratt Center, utilizing student workers who are supervised by licensed professionals to offer low or no cost professional services to underserved communities. For example, The Detroit Collaborative Design Center, or DCDC, at Julie's former school, provides services to the Detroit community, where only 1/3 of the population has a college education, and the median household income is less than half the national average. Based at the only Jesuit School of Architecture, the DCDC opened in 1991 with startup funding from the Jesuits and under the leadership of Dean Steve Vogel, who Julie mentioned, and who had worked in Detroit as a student and was steeped in Jesuit and Catholic community service traditions. Most university-based CDCs operate independently, but draw students and faculty from a particular graduate degree program. Notably, the DCDC did not partner with its existing Master of Architecture program, but rather created a new one in community development. The Association of Collegiate Schools of Architecture lists just 24 out of its 175 accredited architecture programs nationally that have community design centers. Within that small group, some are design build programs and others are not actually situated in architecture. So CDCs could hardly be characterized as a movement within architecture education. However, another way that universities serve communities is through service learning, which has a strong tradition among individual planning and design faculty. These faculty sometimes work as part of university centers, such as the Flourishing Communities Collaborative here, or those at the University of Michigan and Vanderbilt University. Also referred to as community engaged or community-based learning, the Vanderbilt Center describes this type of pedagogy as a means to enhance both student learning and the common good. Still, noted educator Dr. Ernest Boyer observed in his Carnegie Foundation assessment of architecture education that, and this is a quote, community engagement is more often concerned with credentialing students and faculty than with addressing the nation's pressing urban problems, end of quote. In fact, the Vanderbilt Center lists career development as one of its goals for service learning. I agree with Dr. Boyer, who received over 140 honorary doctoral degrees recognizing his contribution to both teaching and learning. The very structure of universities makes them less suited to help young people learn to live together than the organizations in my book. Both Academe and Hulu Opio emphasized loyalty. Staff, through their daily actions, encourage the youth to be loyal to their own moral convictions, to one another, to the organization, and to their families and community. The youth internalize the staff's sense of allegiance, and even though many youth moved on, others remained and allowed both organizations to grow a new generation of community-embedded leaders. I lost my place. Okay, here I am. And carry out the interventions that required many years of determination. At the same time, the founders of both Academe and Huluopio were aware of the need for bringing in new voices and changing to meet new challenges. Universities instead emphasize careers. They measure success not by the loyalty of students and faculty, but by the expansiveness of their national and international reach. Career-oriented measures of success encourage mobility and constant ladder climbing in an attempt to fashion the ideal resume. Consequently, high school students move away from home to attend college. Undergraduate students seek to attend a different graduate school. Schools measure their prowess by the number of alumni who secure employment in other parts of the country, and faculty often change institutions several times in search of more pay, power, and prestige. In this ladder climbing process, local communities and the conflicts that require determination to resolve are left behind. While not wanting to devalue the extraordinary societal benefits of upward mobility, my concern is that the overemphasis upon careers does not help young people address the challenge that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. called out in his book, Chaos or Community, namely, learning to live with each other in a beloved community. In fact, the narrowly conceived design skills and aptitudes that your career-oriented education offers seems almost antithetical to the communitarian habits of mind that socially constructing a contested public domain requires. For example, the young people in my study mentioned developing shared values across generations, practicing solidarity with their peers, families, and neighbors, having a sense of responsibility for improving their community, and working on projects that took many years to realize. Such habits of mind equip them to take on challenges in an increasingly thorny world where people cannot agree on much of anything. I would encourage you to consider whether the dispositions I have described would give you greater collective agency in bringing about transformative change. More to the point, I would encourage you to consider how you can extend your brief moment in socially constructing the built environment. Thank you so much for listening to this circuitous story about how young people can improve their communities and in the process, learn to live together. Thank you very much. I look forward to your question. So we're doing this, Christian. You coming up and we're going to stand up here and, oh, we're going to sit in chairs.
All right, are we good to go? All right. Dr. Sutton, I know I must speak for the entire Department of Architecture when I say it's truly an honor to have you here today, for you to take from your busy schedule to be with us. So I know we're all very thankful for that. And I'll also say, as someone who has been able to live out the legacy of your work, both at University of Michigan and at Georgia Tech, that's something that I am personally very thankful for and has inspired me up to this moment. So it's truly an honor to be up here with you and see this moment come, full circle. And I'm going to try to hold it together as I sit up here and
Okay.
ask you these questions as we keep going, as a big fan of yours. So your book, The Pedagogy of the Beloved Commons, is building upon numerous academic texts that you've written before that. And you're a very accomplished author in that right. In your book, When Ivory Towers Were Black, you portray the experiences of an unparalleled group of ethnic minority students within the Columbia University School of Architecture that question the status quo of architectural education and ultimately transform the architectural discourse at that university to one of emancipatory practices. Unfortunately, at the time, the political environment wasn't fertile for those discussions, but the work is still important to where we've landed today. So within that, I would like to ask you, what do you believe institutions like Georgia Tech, I think about your experiences at University of Michigan, which is so closely tied to the community of Detroit and the rich African-American history there. And I think about Atlanta and the rich African-American history here, especially during Black History Month, when we talk about those issues. What can we do as an institute to better connect with community members in this rich context that we find ourselves in?
Well, I think we should follow the medical model. I mean, the medical school has a hospital that serves the community, and students learn by providing medical services to the community under the supervision of licensed professionals. And I think that should be our model, that we sit in architecture schools and make up abstract problems when there are problems in the community around us. I think is a little bit misguided. The challenge, and that I've been working with the young people at Dark Matter University, which is a group of young professionals, designers, artists, all kinds of professionals who are looking to work across universities to transform them. Their belief is that you can't change one institution, that you have to look systematically. And so their members are not all like, professors. They are in different roles in different places, but they come together to talk about education. And the problem that we've been thinking about is how you sustain a relationship when students graduate and another group of, or when the semester ends, right? You have a project and you have a relationship with the community. You've done it on your schedule, not the community schedule. And so how to overcome that extractive process of universities going into communities and extracting what the students need for their degrees and still leaving behind their problems.
Thank you for that. And you spoke a little bit to students working actively with licensed professionals as they engage in this work in the community. Obviously, the architectural profession is one that is improving, but is still severely lacking in terms of minority representation. So what do you think as a profession, as students move on to work in different practices, what can we do to better encourage the diversity of experiences and perspectives that they bring to the profession?
Well, the typical approach has been, how can we get more minorities into the profession and get them licensed? And my approach is, what does the profession have to do? How does it have to change that minorities want to be in it and that you're not having to recruit them, that they're coming to you. That, you know, if it's a desirable, if you see it as a desirable opportunity, it's going to be self-attracting. So I think that the issue is, you know, how do we have to change to attract people? And education is changing in a way that is sort of frightening, but from other forces, from economic forces, that as the cost of education escalates, people are thinking, well, you know, these students aren't going to want to go to school, but we still want them to get licensed and pay their licensure fees. And so we can have all of our organizations. So what if we just bypass school and we just, you know, have people prepared for practice and in practice, and they don't need to take, they don't, you know, forget about Paulo Freire and critical consciousness. They don't need all that liberal arts stuff. So I think that, you know, it's up to the radical people among us to envision how there can be an education that doesn't bankrupt people, but also allows people to serve the common good.
Thank you for that. As an activist educator and public scholar, you advocate for a participatory planning and design process amongst disenfranchised communities. Can you speak to the benefits of centering the community in design discussions?
Well, you know, we all stand on somebody's shoulders, right? So I stand on Max Bond's shoulders and others before him, but he was my primary mentor. So that quote of his of extent of that we have a brief moment in the life of a building, and how can you extend that moment is by looking not at the pragmatic aspects of the design process, that it is to practically get the thing designed and built as soon as possible because everybody's clock is running, but that it's an opportunity to build community and to have people debate their common vision. And so thinking, you know, he thought in particular of ways that you could leave things unfinished. In fact, my students are working on a sort of idea like that with, we're working on migrant housing, thinking about what, you know, how New York can house the thousands of people, migrants who are coming into the city. And could it be through participatory design in which instead of giving somebody a bunk bed where they wait to get a work permit, that you involve them in, you give them a hammer, you give them the fish and they learn to fish. You know, that they're not doing work that requires a work permit, but they're doing work that creates their own shelter and that also equips them with skills to get jobs.
In thinking about your work and also Bond's quote that design is a brief moment, especially for us, the designer, that truly the community inhabits our designs and gives buildings that transcendence to outlive the life of those that were even involved in the initial planning of it.
Right.
And thinking about the topic of agency in the built environment and allowing those communities that you operate in to have agency in the environments that they create. Can you speak a little bit to how it's important to allow this sense of agency, specifically with communities that may not have had it in the past?
Right. Well, it's very important. And I think the key to agency is ownership, not individual ownership, but collective ownership. You have, you know, the United Nations definition of the right, this is the right to housing or the right to shelter, is the right to tenure. In other words, that you don't just have the house, the shelter, but that you have the right to stay in it. And the only way that you have the right to stay in it is if you own it. So looking at collective models of ownership, which means that people have to learn to live together. Because if you can't work with other people in groups, if you can't kind of compromise your, you know, your ideal, then you can't do things collectively. So being able, I think, agency, not just for low-income people, but for everybody. You know, we're really into a state of not being able to get anything done. You know, people do things to stop rather than to make progress. So agency in life and making progress really depends upon this idea of people learning to live together, to work together. I think that's the reason my publisher started this book series about, you know, what is a community and how do people learn to live in it? Because we've forgotten how to do that. The basis of the country is individualism. It's highly embedded with segregation of different groups. And those two things, the individualistic spirit, the American exceptionalism and all of that, has gotten to a point where we are not able to live together as a beloved community.
Thank you for that answer. During Black History Month, when we tend to forefront the stories of triumph amongst communities of color, I want to think about the heroes that you spoke to in Academy in New York and the low-income students of color that were operating there and really engaging in this process of critical placemaking. That's a very interesting topic to me, that they took active roles in really forming the future and building community amongst themselves so that they could also create environments that build community for those in the future. So my question with that is, what unique approaches and theoretical frameworks of placemaking did you observe amongst those youth of color as they were operating?
There's one quote in the book who's actually from an Arab student. There's I forget what country he was from. He explaining to the interviewer about their efforts, and he said, we build the community inside first so that we can help the community on the outside. And I think that was the primary strategy, was making, you know, I made a diagram of place-based activism, and I didn't change it because I wanted to show my developmental process in writing the book. But initially, I had it very segregated between developing awareness and agency in the organization and then doing placemaking in the community. And it really was a much more fluid thing, that you kind of practiced what you did in the organization in order to do it in the community. And, you know, this school is that kind of a laboratory for practicing in your studios what you want to do and what you aspire to do in the community. So if your studio has unjust relationships, you can't go and seek social justice in the community. We have to make our own community, and then we can go out and help the other community. It was from a young man about 18 years old said that. I thought, why, I'm going to use that.
The richness of the minds of youth is
Yeah,
really
well, and you know, it's youth it's a big group. So whether you're talking about third graders or teenagers or people out here, the agency is in the minds of youth, and in them having the confidence that they can change the systems that are not working, and that is inspiring.
Thank you. Julie spoke to some of your accomplishments even outside of architectural education and practice. And I would be missing an opportunity if I couldn't ask you about, you know, how these different pursuits have really inspired you as a practitioner and educator. So you are a fine artist, and that your work has been shown in numerous areas, including the Library of Congress. And in addition to that, you also were a professional musician. and took part in different performances in New York City, including The Man of La Mancha. How have those pursuits outside of traditional architectural practice influenced your work?
Mhm. How many people in the audience met up with architecture when they were 12? Anybody was 12? Or 13? Before you got to college? Most people before they got to college. So, and that's, you know, what you do when you're very young has a formative aspect on your personality. So I decided I wanted to be a musician when I was 12. And that was, you know, my whole, and therefore I see the world, you know, I was a French horn player. If you know the French horn, you'll recognize that I sort of talk like a French horn player, the low, mellow voice. And so I think that's the shaping of even my research that oh, it wasn't always my dog. I thought it was my dog that was, there's a second dog that maybe was rattling the chains. I thought my dog was saying, please get it over with. So even in my research, the qualitative research that, you know, music is done from the heart. You can't make music unless your heart is in it. And so that's kind of the lens that I do all of my work from. The fine art was because when I went to architecture school, I was actually a union member and I had a really good job in the Broadway theater. And these architecture professors said, oh, no, you can't work and go to architecture school. You'll have to quit your job. And I did. And I sold my French horn. And then I was hungry. It was years before I earned as much as I earned as a musician. So yeah, that's kind of the lens through which I see the world.
And I'll say this is my
Oh, I started telling that long story to say that the reason I started doing art is because I had sold my French horn. And in architecture, you make these drawings and then nothing happens to them. In music, you practice in the morning, you go out in the evening and you play the performance and people clap. So I needed something that was more immediate. And that's when I started doing printmaking.
Mhm.
So that's how art came in. It was kind of a substitute for having something that was more immediate that you could complete. You could put it up on the wall, people would come and look at it and clap.
You really build a beautiful body of work from that I would recommend everyone looks at after this lecture and can be inspired as I was when I looked at it as well. And this is just my final question, and I would love to open it up to the student body and faculty body for questions as well. In thinking about the pedagogy of the Olu Opio and the Wa'ani youth that you spoke about in Hawaii, who use their agency to reclaim heritage lands and heal the exploited practices of colonization, I'm reminded of the topic of reparations, not as a charged political term, but as a design practice that allows communities of color to begin the work alongside allied communities of healing from past traumas as it relates to systemic oppression and allow them to flourish into the future.
Yeah.
So given your experience documenting and establishing settings that promote engagement among disenfranchised communities, can you describe what you think reparative design looks like for communities of color?
I had a long conversation this morning with some of your students on this topic and trying to get a handle on what their view of repair is. I mean, we're looking at repair of generational trauma. I think, I learned so much from the Hulu Opio group. I mean, just to understand what the interviews meant, what people were saying to me. I had to learn something about their culture. I one of the interviews, the question was, "What race, ethnicity are you?" And the director responded, "I'm the human race." It went on from there. So, it was a real learning experience for me, but uh, the idea of repair that I got from that organization was making a place on the earth is very restorative. And I think, going from Ivan Illich, who was a big, he hated the professions. He hated the professionalization of design. I forget the name of the book, Deprofessionalizing or something like that, of where the things that ordinarily people do to literally make their place on the earth have been taken away and given over to professionals. So we can't go back. I mean, we're here, we're all trained, we love our work, but how can we help people through our work make their own place? And that goes to your question about participatory design. It's really the idea that you're not giving someone food. I think somebody in your class said, we want people to have food that they don't have to worry about getting. But one of the motivating things for the Hulu Opio youth was creating the food from the mud and giving it to other people. It wasn't somebody giving them the food. It was the act, their being able to reclaim the earth and produce the food. We don't produce anything anymore. We buy stuff, and we have to make money to buy stuff. So I think reparative is somehow, as professionals, enabling a process in which people can make a place for themselves upon the earth.
Thank you so much for your answer to that. And I think that's an important topic to dwell on as we open it up for audience questions as well.